Hello and welcome to OT the podcast. We are here. We're talking about watches, we're talking about time and how to spend it. My name is Felix Schultz.
And I'm Andy Green.
Hello Andy, how are you today?
I am fantastic. How are you, mate?
I'm pretty
jazzed up?
Jazzed up's maybe the wrong word. I think this is going to be a good one. It's a bit serious, it's a bit different. It's not quite light-hearted banter.
No, this is a bit of a big deal. It's not every day you get an Australian of the Year on the show.
Yeah. So we are speaking to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Richard Harris. How do we know? Have you heard the name Richard Harris before?
It sounds familiar. What do I associate him with?
Well, the main thing that you would maybe know Richard Harris from is because he was the guy who was fairly instrumental in rescuing a Thai soccer team and their coach of young kids in the Tham Luang cave system in June, July of 2018.
Okay,
he's a cave diver, he's an anesthetist, he's an all-round nice guy who is far more hardcore than we can ever be, and we're going to get him on the phone in a few minutes.
Not only that, he's received the Star of Courage.
Oh yeah, what's that?
The Medal of the Order of Australia.
Natch.
He's a Knight of the Grand Cross.
Sure.
And he was Australian of the Year in 2019.
No biggie.
He's a published author.
Yeah.
And he's got a podcast called Real Risk, which we'll get into with him.
Yeah, sure. He's also a Bremont ambassador.
He is, and thank you to Bremont for teeing this interview up with him.
A perfect fit. I mean, they like, action-oriented kind of lads and lasses, and he seems like the guy for them.
He's putting that watch to work. Before we get him on the phone, Felix, what's been happening?
Well, I mean, another watch that I've been putting to work is from Ball.
Tell me about it.
It's the Ball Engineer 2 Green Beret, which is it's a watch. It's black. It's 43 millimeters. It's under $3,300 Aussie dollars. It's good. It's been wearing it around. I've been wearing it on the Erica strap, which gives it a bit of a tactical feel. But do you know about Ball?
A little bit. They've got the Lumi tubes.
The main thing is, as you have so accurately said, the Lumi tubes.
Mm-hmm.
The cool thing about Ball is that they use photoluminescent gas. So it's low-key radioactive gas in tiny glass tubes.
What's on brand for an anesthetist, isn't it?
Yeah, but the thing that I like about it, and it trips me out, is so normally with a superluminova sort of powered watch, you get that real bright bloom when you go outside and come inside. You don't get that with a Ball, but what it does do is it will glow all night long. Yeah, it'll just go through. And so, you normally if you wake up at 2 a.m, you can't see your watch that well because it's faded. But this one, really bright. Like I used to have it, I had it, I've been wearing it for the last few weeks, had it by the bedside table. Can't do that anymore, too bright.
Yeah, rock on.
Yeah, it's great. I really like it. It's a nice watch. I've always had a real soft spot for Ball. It was one of the first watches I reviewed back in the day. And
awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
solid.
We'll be back in a moment. Today's episode is brought to you by Swiss Typefaces, who help make the show possible. Have you ever wondered, Felix, what the city of Stockholm, Google Android, and David Beckham's football team Inter Miami have in common with OT the podcast?
I have.
Well, for those who don't know, we all use the same fonts from Swiss Typefaces. When we were building the visual identity of OT, we knew that the right typeface was going to be very, very important because they're everywhere, especially when you're in digital, which, let's be honest, everyone is.
But I find typefaces, they're often overlooked, which is why there's so much stock Comic Sans out there in the world.
Yuck. We knew we wanted something a little bit more cool and a little bit more custom, which is exactly what Swiss Typefaces was able to offer. We ended up with Euclid, which we like for its strong geometry and very graphic feel. It's on our logo, our social media, and it's a big part of the OT brand, though we did nearly go with some of the very cool, very wild and experimental fonts in their lab section.
So if you're building a brand or looking to refresh your existing one, don't overlook the typeface and check out SwissTypefaces.com. Andy, what have you been liking these days?
A lot, actually. This week, though, I'm going to throw out a guy. He's an Instagram account, very reasonably small. It's called Watch Speak Easy. Have you heard of him?
I don't think so.
Yeah, he's reasonably small, but he's a guy out of New York, and he takes these really interesting macro photos.
Watch guys love a macro.
These are a bit different. I think the macro trend is well and truly over, but what I really like about this account is the composition and the way he sort of frames the images that he puts up. the one I'm looking at now it's a Nomos, and he's done like a loom shot. We were just talking about loom, but you can see the glow of the loom underneath the hand on the dial.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the reflection from the glass.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. He's looking at it with a compositional and artistic eye.
Yeah, he's got to be a photographer
Yeah.
of some sort to structure his shots like this.
Yeah.
And the detail and the way he'll use, a lot of macro shots are really pretty and show off the best bits, but he'll do like a scuffed, crown or bezel insert or whatever it is. And I just think it's a really cool take. Some of the other style of things that he does is, you can see like the grain of like the paint on the seconds hand, which is tiny, and it looks like like Cheeto dust on like an orange hand. So he stands out for me. We'll link him up. Yeah, he's like 1,500 followers, but we'll blow that up after this comes out.
1,502. Yeah, named Andy and Felix.
# influence. What about you, Felix?
This is a bit of a weird one. I was
good.
It's something I like it, but I'm not sure how I feel about it. I was researching Porsche design.
Okay.
For their watches and stuff. I was just Googling around, and I came across the Tri-Wing S91X Pegasus Starfighter, which is a Star Wars spaceship.
Okay. That
has been designed by Porsche Design.
Let me pull this up. Oh, wow.
So it's very odd. So not only is it a Star Wars vehicle that has been designed by Porsche Design, like proper designers, and the sort of the press materials, I'll send a link through, or we'll put a link in the notes. It sort of talks about the design challenges of designing something futuristic and not real, because that's I get that on a design level, but also it doesn't actually appear in the movies,
right?
So it's purposeless.
So there's a lot of effort going into something.
But then I sort of thought about it a bit more. So this is maybe not things we've liked, but things we were weirdly intrigued by. And as far as marketing goes, I reckon for a luxury company like Porsche, it's not a bad move, because, and I'm going to be, this comes from a place of love, nerds with money spend their money on some weird stuff.
Yeah.
Like, in the same way that other people go, whoa, you spent that much money on that watch, nerds will do that with other things.
Yeah, audio files,
photography. But like just weirdly expensive reproduction, Star Wars memorabilia.
But this is a model, right? Like you can...
it was just presented. It was presented at like the launch, and it was just a weird tie-in.
5 feet long. Okay.
And I think they made an actual one, and they did a CAD sort of render that, it was like a design exercise.
Okay, let me read this out. So the basic shape of the cabin which tapers towards the rear, and highly distinctive topography from the cockpit flyline to the turbines establish visual parallels with the iconic design of the 911 and the Taycan.
I mean, that's a reach. We're gonna click on the link, have a look at this, and see if you can see the classic 911 anywhere in that.
Yeah, look, that's debatable,
but it's cool. I think I found it interesting in terms of like a low-key marketing thing. Guys with money, good way to get them in the door if they never considered a Porsche before. So that's something I've liked.
Love it. Well, it's time to call Dr. Richard Harris.
Let's get him on the line.
Richard, great to have you on the phone. How are you going today?
Hi guys, I'm great, thank you.
Fantastic. You're our first audio and visual guest calling in from South Australia.
Using FaceTime, Apple's proprietary system. Wonderful.
I'm told I've got a good face for radio, so maybe the visual part...
we'll have to,
We're with you there.
Yeah.
So obviously people might well know your name and have heard about you because of your involvement with what's known as the Taycan rescue, which happened in 2017?
2018.
2018.
2 years ago.
Wow.
The anniversary is coming up in another month.
So can you tell us, how did you become involved in that in the first place?
There's a fairly long backstory to it, but in a nutshell, I was learning to cave dive and learning to be an anesthetist almost in parallel. Mm-hmm. And I guess they were the two skills that brought me to the rescue. And so I've been cave diving since 1986 when I was in my early 20s at university. Mm-hmm. And I've been diving in the ocean for quite a few years before that as a young lad. Mm-hmm. And when I got more and more involved particularly in exploration cave diving, I started to realise that we were visiting some very remote places, not just geographically, but in terms of being on the far side of a sump, which is a water-filled section of cave, and exploring dry cave beyond that sump. So in other words, you have to dive through a section of water, come out into a dry area of cave, and then push on exploring. And whilst I was exploring a cave like that out on the Nullarbor Plain in Western Australia in about 2008, I suddenly thought to myself, if I fall over here or have an accident, break a leg, or worse, who on earth is going to come in and rescue me, and how are they going to go about it? So I went home with that thought in mind and started to plan a rescue exactly along those lines. And I got together with a bunch of mates and we started to do a bit of practice in some of the easier caving sites around the country. And from that, we actually generated a little training course, which we could put divers through and run through some scenario training. And I've been running that course around Australia and in New Zealand since that time, since about 2010. So I guess my name started to get out there in terms of having an interest in cave rescue where water was involved. And I knew some of the guys who were involved in the rescue, particularly the British divers and a couple of expat Europeans who live in Thailand.
Okay.
So when those boys were finally found by the two Brits, then my name was mentioned as someone who, as an anaesthetist and a doctor, as well as a cave diver with an interest in cave rescue, maybe I could be of some assistance. So that's it.
That must have been a really short list. To your knowledge, are there any other cave diving doctors or cave diving anaesthetists out there in the world, or are you one of a kind?
The unicorn.
No, there's quite. Well, I was called a unicorn. A unicorn. There are quite a few cave diving doctors, and I know of several cave diving anaesthetists, and a couple of them are very high level cave divers and explorers. But I was probably the one who was closest and best known to the guys who were on the ground at the time.
Yeah,
so there would have been a few other choices around the world, but as you suggest, it's there's not hundreds to choose from.
Incredible. So you got the call, you kind of got your boots on the ground, but it was a very hands-on rescue. I mean, I've kind of done a little bit of reading, and so has Felix. But can you tell us what was actually involved from a logistical perspective in the rescue?
It was an extraordinarily complex rescue. There were so many options to consider along the way. And to be honest, the very last one that was being considered was what actually happened in the end. I mean, there is no more dangerous thing that you could undertake than to render someone unconscious with an anaesthetic, immerse them in water and expect them to come out of the water 3 hours later and still be alive and breathing. So...
Just to sort of, can you, in a nutshell, just to someone that might not be familiar with what happened, can you describe what the plan that ended up happening was? Like, what did you do to these young guys?
Yeah, well, when I arrived, obviously I had to go through all the other options that were on the table before I could be even convinced to try this. Mm-hmm. And that's a story in itself. But once all those other options were eliminated, I agreed to anaesthetise the boys to have them brought through the cave. So the plan, as it turned out, was that I would go to the far end of the cave, a place called Chamber 9, which was about 2.5 kilometres from the entrance of the cave. And I would be joined by 4 of the lead British divers, and those 4 divers would have the responsibility of actually physically taking one boy each all the way out through the cave. And we staggered some other divers along that route, the 2.4 kilometres, to assist them along the way, to give them some support and help as they popped up through each water-filled section and into one of the canal sections. Mm-hmm. And my job was to assess each boy, bring them down to the water, have them sit on my knee, and while I administered the anaesthetic injection, which was an intramuscular injection into their leg. Mm-hmm. It would take about 5 minutes for them to lose consciousness, and then myself and one of the British divers would finish dressing them in the appropriate diving gear. The most important part of that gear was a full face mask, which would protect their airway from ingress of water. So unlike a normal snorkeling or scuba outfit where you've got a half mask just covering your eyes and nose, and then a regulator or a snorkel in your mouth, this was designed to cover their whole face, so they didn't have to be conscious enough to hold anything in their mouth. Obviously, if the regulator drops out underwater, then you drown. So this full face mask, the idea was that it would keep the water out and they could just breathe in and out. So once they were completely anaesthetised, we would do a couple of tests by pushing their head underwater and making sure that they were breathing and that the mask wasn't leaking at all. And once we were happy with that, we packaged them up by securing their hands behind their back. We actually cable tied their hands together behind their backs and tied their ankles together. Now, that was something, obviously, that was morally quite a difficult thing to do, and it's one thing that attracted a little bit of attention from the press, as you can well imagine. I think one of the headlines I saw was Thai boys drugged and handcuffed, which, it's not the way I would have put it, but it's certainly
accurate.
It's accurate, yeah.
It happens.
Yeah. And the reason for that was twofold. Firstly, to make sure the boys' arms didn't float out and get hooked up on any of the stalactites and things, because the cave was very tight in places, and the boys had to be like a pencil, like a dart, to be able to push through these very tight holes in the cave, and then the English diver either go through first or follow them through. And the same with the legs. We couldn't just have them flailing about. And the second reason was that if the boy did suddenly wake up underwater, then it was imperative that he didn't panic and reach up and rip his face mask off, or even more concerning, do the same thing to the rescue diver. So it was to protect the boy and the diver.
Now, how were the boys in terms of comfortability with this plan and idea? I would be freaking out if you told me you were going to shoot me full of ketamine, cable tie me, and drag me out of a cave.
Look, I don't really know the answer to that question, but all I can tell you is they appear to be incredibly robust and calm. And, the real heroes of this rescue are those 12 boys and their coach. They were exceptionally courageous young people. And, of course, there was a big language barrier. I didn't speak Thai, and they spoke very few words of English. So I'm not completely clear how much they understood about what was going to happen. I actually had a letter written in Thai for the boys to be presented with, so that they would exactly understand all the dot points of the plan.
Gosh.
And there was a Thai Navy SEAL doctor in there, Dr. Park, who spoke quite good English, and he read this plan out to the boys. And I was watching the boys' faces as he did so, and they were just smiling and giving me the thumbs up. Yep, no worries. And I'm thinking, do you really understand what we're proposing here? Because I had literally zero faith that this was going to work and these boys could survive.
In terms of risk, this extraction, where is it ranked, and in terms of, I guess, likelihood of success as well?
Well, in my view, and I did feel that I was the most informed person on the ground, being not just a diver but also an anaesthetist, I gave it 0% chance of working.
What do you mean working? Like what was your level of success? Like were you going, okay, a good result here is if we get one out or 5 out or all of them out? What was the best case scenario,
I was far more pessimistic than that. I thought the first 2 boys would drown in the first diving section, which was about 300 metres long or about a 20-minute transit. And I thought they will drown, and then I got Rick Stanton, one of the British divers, to place himself at the far end of that first dive. And after the first couple of kids went through, his job was to come back and come through and tell me what had happened. And my expectation was that he would come out or come in, tell me that both the kids had succumbed in that first dive, and then we would call it off for the day and go out and see if there was anything we could change or reassess. And I don't know if I could have continued at all if that had happened. And a lot of people have said, well, if you genuinely didn't believe it would work, how could you possibly have a go at it even? And the answer to that was that the alternative, if possible, was even worse. And that was that those boys would be condemned to a very slow and unpleasant death, sitting in there dying of exposure or starvation or infection over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And the idea that if they were going to die, that they would die in their sleep, I guess that seemed a better option. I mean, that's a pretty ordinary basis for a plan by anyone's standards, but I felt like I couldn't walk away without at least giving this a try.
Yeah, that's not a decision I would ever want to make. So, kudos to you for
risking your life to be down there.
And having to make those sort of decisions, which are quite huge. One thing you said just before was something that triggered something for me. You said that you got one of the divers to come back and talk to you because, of course, I assume you'd have no radio communications underground at that level, would you?
No, we had no comms at all back in the far reaches of the cave. The first 600 metres of the cave was, well, we call it dry cave, but there was a river running through it. But there was communications from there to the outside world, and that place was called Chamber 3. It was our advanced dive base. And there were dozens of Thai Navy personnel based in Chamber 3, actually living and camping in there. They had a fibre optic connection with Wi-Fi in there, and so they were getting updates from the World Cup soccer and getting food and drink brought into them. But they were doing it tough, living in the mud there.
Yeah, sure. So what I was sort of wanting, I thought about that is because you spoke about how intense the planning process was. Like, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Who was in charge of like coordinating all that? Like, there's a lot of moving parts there, and all you need is one diver to go, was I waiting 45 minutes or was I waiting, half an hour for everything to start falling apart? What are the risks around that, like actual logistics of timing and who's doing what and when, all that stuff?
The risks were massive of that, and there were some glitches in the plan, particularly on the first day while we're all trying to work out where we should be and what time we should be there. So we ended up with about 14 cave divers, just volunteers or civilians, in the cave itself beyond Chamber 3, out of communication. And we acted very much as an autonomous group of people, and we had our own planning sessions around that.
Oh, really?
But ultimately, the Thai leadership was running the whole show, and the governor of the province was the rescue controller.
Yep.
And the Thai military in all its forms was there, as well as militaries and rescue organisations from multiple other countries. So keeping all those moving parts on track would have been an absolute nightmare. And I understand there were nearly 10,000 people on or around that mountain by the end of the rescue.
Gosh.
So it's a very complex organisational situation.
Yeah, that's wild. Now, let's not forget that the team had been down there for, was it 2 weeks prior to the extraction, and it took several days to get them all out? In terms of just a regular sort of cave dive, I say regular quite loosely, where would you rank this in sort of your recreational enjoyment of cave diving?
If there were no children to be rescued, would I go
down
swim in there? Absolutely not. And the reason for that is that we would never dive in a cave that was actively flooding. We dive in caves that are flooded.
Yep.
And we go caving in caves that are dry, but sometimes, damp. But you would never go into a cave that's evolving in terms of flooding actively, because it's a very unstable environment. And, when the British divers first arrived on scene, and other divers as well, they physically couldn't make their way into the flow of the water that was coming out the entrance. They just got spat out. And it was only because the rains eased off for a few days that they finally made sufficient progress to find and identify the boys. So they were very aware of what the cave conditions could be like. And every day it was raining, and the forecast was that the monsoon was going to come back in force over the next 48 to 72 hours. So the Brits who had seen this in action were very anxious about what would happen if that happened, a flood pulse coming through whilst we were in there. And that was a real threat, particularly on the final rescue day.
So the risk was very real there, and for all the divers involved, including yourself. And I guess in terms of bravery, that's right up there, and probably explains why you were awarded Australian of the Year last year in 2019, and several other really, really big accolades, I think. I'm really keen to hear how this great act of bravery has changed your life kind of since then.
Funny that it has changed my life so dramatically, because I can honestly say when I came back from Thailand, I had no idea of the size of the global story that had surrounded this event. We felt like we were a couple of volunteers, Craig and myself, who had gone over to lend a hand because we had some particular skills that clearly were of use. But, to us it was just, it was part adventure. It was, we were excited to be going over there. We had been training for such a thing, and would be lying if I didn't say that we were pretty keen to put those skills into action. I mean, I often say it's like someone in the fire service who's trained all their life to put out a fire and then actually never gets the call. you'd be a bit frustrated. So we were feeling a little bit like that, and we were happy to be involved. And also, cave diving is what we do for fun on the weekends. The cave itself wasn't, it's sort of 7 out of 10 for difficulty. We've done worse things on expeditions. So that in itself wasn't a great concern to us. And then the anaesthesia itself, that's what I do every day at work, although this obviously was in a slightly unusual environment. But putting it all together, I really could look at it as a job, just, the next patient, one foot in front of another kind of approach. And it was really only the moral dilemmas that for me were the truly difficult thing. And I guess if there's one thing that I'm really proud of for myself and for the other team members is that we did have the courage to give this a try. But I never really could say that I felt physically in any great danger. It was, a solid few days, but it wasn't the worst I've had.
Yeah, amazing. And has that, you were sort of saying how you've been training for this, I guess, since you've had that moment in the Nullarbor where you thought this was a good idea. Has it changed, or this, hands-on experience, has it changed your practice or your training in any ways, or advanced the field of underwater cave rescue?
Well, it certainly changed the whole landscape of underwater rescue because, this was completely unprecedented and hitherto had been considered impossible, to be honest, including by myself, because we had trained exactly for something like this. We'd played around with a diver who was pretending to be unconscious just to see if the full face mask would keep the water out, for example. And our experience was that it was a complete failure. So, I really went into this with some background or a data set almost that would suggest that this wasn't going to work. So I think, I would never, I would have enormous concerns about repeating this performance. I would go into it with almost as much trepidation, but I guess there is precedent now that it does work.
Yeah, awesome. It's really interesting when you kind of say it's like there's people that prepare for a particular event and wait around and it never happens, and that makes me think of gear as well, and kind of people that have tools and instruments ready to go and they never really put them to work. And obviously, we are a watch podcast, and I'm really kind of keen to hear how timepieces and dive watches come into play in your life and in your cave diving, because 99.9% of dive watches never, see more than 10 centimeters of water, whereas, you really put them to work. So I'd love to kind of hear about, the watches that perhaps you dive with and how important they are in a practical sense.
Well, there's really two types of things we wear on our wrists or our arms when we're diving. And initially when I started diving, it was a classic timepiece, a dive watch with the rotating bezel around the outside. And you use that to time your time underwater. And if you were getting into deeper water or the possibility of decompression requirements, we would have some tables that we would look at underwater. And so I'd go, right, I've been at 30 metres for 30 minutes, and so I know I need to stop at 6 metres on the way up for 3 minutes, and so forth. Then in the 80s and 90s, more and more people started using dive computers, which told you everything that you needed to know. And so the classic timepieces have really been lost a little to actual diving practice. But there's still a few traditionalists like myself who like to have a watch on and keep it on the whole time and not have to take it off just because you're going, deeper than what the average watch can bear. And one thing about the dive computers is it's not immediately obvious what the time of day is.
Yeah.
And I still like to know that, especially if you're doing a dive that's 16 hours in duration, like one I did in February in New Zealand. It's very easy to become disorientated in time. You don't know whether, and you're underground, you're in the dark. There's no reference to whether it's night or day. So having a proper watch on is really reassuring. So I still like to wear one.
Yeah, nice. So last time we spoke, you had just come back, I think, from that New Zealand trip. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is? And like it's not just a one-off event for you; it's sort of an annual pilgrimage.
Yeah, it's my annual holiday.
Yeah,
get away from it all.
Tell us what your annual holiday involves.
Yeah, well, what I did on my holidays by Harris. So we go to New Zealand, we camp for 2 weeks in the bush at the head of a river called the Pierce River, and the river comes out of a hole in the ground at this point, at the base of a cliff, and we swim down the hole and try to find where the water's coming from. Now, we know from putting fluorescein dye in a cave that's about 1 kilometre away that actually the water comes through that cave. So we've joined the dots hypothetically, but we still haven't managed to swim that distance. And until you've actually swum and mapped the cave, then you kind of haven't been there, I guess. So we know about a theoretical connection, but we want to make a physical connection. Unfortunately, the cave continues and gets deeper and deeper, and at the moment is heading exactly 180 degrees in the wrong direction. So it's getting further away from the source, which is an enormous mystery, and it's become a kind of an addictive problem for me to try and solve. And really, I would like to get to that point where at least the cave turns around and starts heading in the right direction, even if I can't follow it all the way. So I started going there in 2007, and I've gone there pretty much every year since. And incrementally, we've got further and deeper into this cave until the last dive that Craig Challen and I did was to 245 metres depth, and that's the cave that took 16 hours to complete. Wow. And most of that was doing decompression, just hanging in the water or staring at the wall.
So, how 248 metres did you say?
Oh, now don't exaggerate. You're like 245 metres.
Oh, maybe you'll hit the big 248 this year.
Try harder.
We could see down a hole, so I'm sure it is at least that.
So in terms of the scale of the number of, or how deep is that in sort of, I guess, records of the deepest dives or...
it's about 40 metres depth short of the deepest cave dive ever done in the world. I think there's 5 or 6 caves that have been dived deeper, and they're all in that, they lie between that depth and about 286 metres.
Are you hoping it's going to be something you're going to have to go down another 40 or 50 metres so you can take that?
No, absolutely not, because we are already at the edge of the envelope in terms of what's safe. There's a lot of physiology and physics that's starting to come into play at these depths, particularly beyond 250 metres, I think, that make it exponentially more unsafe and risky as you pass that point. So really, I'd be very happy if it turned around right now and headed back to the surface, which of course brings in new logistical problems, whether we can actually do remote decompression coming up towards a cave that's 1 kilometre away without knowing that suddenly we'll find a pinch point that we can't fit through before we get to the surface, for example.
Gosh.
So I fear that we've just about reached the end of the line, literally and metaphorically.
That's super interesting. And I'm sitting here wondering, and I'm sure Felix is thinking the same, but do you have a death wish? Because I don't think most people have what it takes to, get down that deep.
It's a niche hobby, hey?
It's a niche hobby, and it's got me thinking what makes a good diver and cave diver in terms of characteristics and personality traits. How do you stay focused and calm? What is it? What's the secret to a good cave dive?
A long-lived cave diver.
Yeah, well, exactly. And you've hit something right on the head, which is of enormous interest to me. And I love talking to other adventurers and other, risk takers or perceived risk takers to find out what makes them tick. And universally, I find that the people who are successful at doing things like are exactly the opposite in terms of having a death wish. They are extraordinarily careful and calculated and do everything possible to mitigate the risk. And one of the most important things is building experience very slowly and exposing yourself gradually to, the increased complexity of doing things like diving to these depths, because there's less and less room for error. So just as an example, if you're in a shallow cave and you've got a couple of cylinders of air with you and a line, which we always run through the cave, a bit of string basically that allows us to navigate back to the entrance, that suddenly gets wrapped around your fin on your leg. And, you have to sort of contort yourself a little bit to untangle it. And in doing so, you brush against the bottom and all the silk comes up and suddenly you can't see anything. And when you first start, that sort of minor incident can be very anxiety provoking. But once you're experienced in that setting and that environment, that kind of thing becomes a very routine problem and you just sort it out without a second thought. Now, if you transfer that incident now to 240 metres, there's suddenly a lot more imperative to solve the problem much more rapidly, because every minute that you're at that depth is adding up to half an hour of decompression time on the way up.
Yeah.
And as soon as you start to get agitated and overexcited, your breathing rate increases, which causes some physiological disturbances in your respiratory function, which can rapidly prove fatal. So you just have to be happy to be there. You have to be able to say, oh, well, I've got a line around my leg. I'm just going to have to sink to the bottom and sort this out the same as I would if I was 5 metres underwater.
Okay.
But as soon as you start to rush, then you're in strife. And that just takes years and years of practice to be able to reach that kind of state of relaxation in what would be a fairly challenging situation.
So you have to zen out. You've touched on it a couple of times now, and it's something that really interests me, and that is it comes down to the fact that you are going to these depths, nearly 250 metres, not quite. That's really pushing most dive watches in terms of depth rating. Obviously, there are watches that can go much deeper, and they have these helium escape valves, but I'd really like to hear your explanation of decompression and why it matters and how you actually use a dive watch to do these things, because a lot of people wouldn't really know how their watch works and why you need a helium escape valve and how even helium escape valves came out to be featured in watches.
Well, your watch doesn't care, of course, because it's not absorbing gas into its tissues. It's just takes some gas down with it, and it's an incompressible structure, and it comes back to the surface. And if there is a bit of extra gas in it, it's allowed to escape through this valve. But in the human body, the deeper we are, the higher the pressure of the gases, which drives more inert gas, which is nitrogen in the air we breathe, or helium in the gas mixtures we breathe at depth. Drives those inert gases into your body's tissues, your muscles, your bones, your blood, and so forth. And you become very, very loaded with these gases. Now, if you then race back to the surface, you don't give these gases time to escape from the tissues. And the analogy we commonly use is like taking the lid off a Coke bottle. Suddenly, you'll see some bubbles form in the Coke. Whereas if you just release the cap very steadily and slowly, you'll hear a hiss, but you won't see bubbles form in the fluid. And the analogy is perfect for divers returning from the depths. If you come up nice and slowly, the gas has time to move out of the tissues without forming bubbles. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. So the bends or decompression sickness is caused by these bubbles in the tissues, which causes injury or death.
And how serious, like is if you sort of push those decompression times, or if you come up really quickly, is that something that like there's a chance you will have some adverse effect, or it will happen? Is there some sort of, is it like rolling the dice?
From 245 metres, it's a matter of certainty. You wouldn't get 3/4 of the way to the surface, you'd be dead.
Wow. Cool.
Your body's brought up from deep water, physically fizz and explode. It's most unpleasant.
Okay.
You can't miss out on 16 hours of avoiding bubble formation, unfortunately, without fairly dire consequences.
Yeah,
so that means you've got to sort out any problems you've got underwater. You can't just go home. I'm tired or scared or cold. I want to go home.
You have to deal with it. Well, it's a fascinating topic, and I know that the helium escape valve was actually added to the watch because these divers, these deep sea dwellers, were taking their watches so far down that the crystals would pop off, and like you say, there was nowhere for the gas to escape. So they added that feature, and it was sort of implemented by a diving company that they really pushed for it. What do you like to dive with? You said you were old school and you like a timepiece on your wrist when you're going under. What do you dive with?
Well, I've got my Bremont watch that we...
Very nice.
I think you mentioned at the start, and it's the Supermarine S2000, which means it's able to go a lot further than I will ever go. It's rated to go to 2,000 metres, so 245 metres shouldn't give it any trouble at all, I don't think.
Any interest in kind of going deep sea diving with it, or you just stick to caves?
Well, that's where the helium escape valve really comes into its own. If you're in a dry environment like the saturation divers, the commercial dives, that's when helium being such a small molecule, I imagine, I'm not a watch manufacturer, but I imagine it can creep past the seals into the watch, and that's why they need a valve to let it escape. But if we're underwater, then that's not an issue. So I'm not sure if mine has got that valve or not.
I don't know if they do. S2000s?
I think they do, yeah. It's a big one. Yeah,
I got no idea.
We'll check.
There's 3 different theories around it. 1, you don't let the helium in at all. 2, you have a valve you can open to release it manually. And 3, it comes out automatically. So there's you know.
Well, when they were racing to develop this technology, I believe it was Omega, did the first method you mentioned where they just made it impossible and they put these big clocks onto the whatever it was they were diving down on, and obviously Rolex developed the Sea Dweller, which had the valve, and it was this whole race to kind of develop the technology first.
Weird technologies. And you said something before, Richard, about having to solve problems while you were down there. What are some common, aside from the environmental issues that you're dealing with, like, you get your line snagged or you come across a pinch point in a cave or something like that. What are common issues and problems that, you have to deal with on a fairly deep dive?
Well, we try and avoid any problems, obviously. So, a good dive is one where nothing goes wrong, but there's always little things. And, whether it's you're having difficulty because you're very cold and fatigued by, reaching equipment or unclipping something because your hands have got so cold. This cave is only 6 degrees Celsius. So it's 4 hours before we reach the first habitat, which is a little decompression refuge that we put in the cave at 40 metres depth. So it's like an upturned bucket that's filled up with air, and we can crawl up into there and sit with the top half of our body out of the water, which helps us stay warm enough to survive, basically, because after 4 hours in 6 degrees, even with the best dry suit and undergarments, heated vest and so forth, we are starting to get really cold. So if we had a flood in our dry suit, for example, if we had a seal that tore and water got inside the suit, we'd be in all sorts of trouble. And so these habitats, and we've got 4 of them in the cave between 40 metres and the surface, these habitats are a life-saving refuge as well as a comfort thing if there's a problem like that. And as I mentioned, there's just no way around it. You have to endure the time under pressure. You cannot go to the surface until, you can shave a little bit of time off and get away with it, but you can't shave hours and hours off. So if you're cold, you're stuck with it.
And so all this sort of adds up. You were talking a little bit before about how at the moment the depth you're operating at there is already pushing the envelope. And is there a depth or an area where you think the human body cannot go past? Like,
I'd never say that because it keeps being pushed further and further out. When people started doing free diving, the physiologists estimated that according to the size of the chest and the volume of the chest, the amount that it could be compressed as a free diver descends would limit their excursion to about 60 metres in theory. Beyond that, the lungs would just be crushed and the heart would be crushed. Well, clearly that has been thrown well and truly in the waste paper bin, that concept, because free divers are now going beyond 200 metres.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about that is that those guys now are getting severe gas narcosis from the depth. They can get decompression sickness on the way up because all the gas that they took down with them gets driven into the tissues and doesn't get out fast enough on the way up. And their lungs are squashed the size of size of an apple, and their chest is partially full of fluid so that it doesn't, compress. And that's something we learnt from mammalian diving physiology in whales and so forth. So, well, we didn't learn it from them, but we recognised it in them. They could probably teach us a few things though.
Yep. Andy, you've got something about watches, I thought. Yeah,
well, you've mentioned a few times that you're a little bit into watches. I'm really keen to hear why you chose the S2000 of all the watches that you could have, and if you have any sort of other watches or if you've seen any other watches along the way that have caught your interest.
I've got a drawer full of watches. I'm a watch nut, I'm afraid. And but this is the first proper watch I've had, if you like, actual quality timepiece. Yep. And I was fascinated by the story of Bremont, and it's a homegrown family company from London. I can picture little men in their coats, with their spectacles on, putting the hands on the watches in there. I've never been there. I don't know what it's like, but that's my image of it. It's proper.
Proper English stuff, huh?
Yeah. And the ambassadors that they have are extraordinary adventurers. Guys like Nirmal Purja, I'm sorry if I said his name wrong, but Nims, as everyone refers to him, the amazing climber who did the 14 mountains in 6 months when the previous record was 8 years or something. Oh, yeah. Guys like that are just so cool. Why wouldn't you want to be part of that team?
There was another guy.
Well, hold on. I think you are part of that team. I'm going to say, just hold on a second, Felix. You rescued a whole soccer team from a cave, so I think you deserve to be amongst those ranks.
You might not have canoed across the Atlantic, but I think what you did was just as difficult in slightly different ways.
Yeah. So you've kind of, you're a bit of a watch nut. This is the big one. What's next for you? You must have your eye on something then.
Another watch?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I think, the reason I like this one and why I think I'll be sticking with it for a good period of time is that I haven't had another watch which actually can go caving with me and come out without a scratch on the glass. Yeah. And I have yet to be able to scratch this thing. I don't know what they've done to the glass face, but, I've dived with the sapphire, diamond, whatever glass faces on different watches. As soon as you go into the dry cave and start climbing up ropes and wriggling through rocks, that's the end of your watch. It's good night.
So it's cave
proof.
So
far, so good, yeah.
Wow.
And I heard you got pretty creative going on a dive with it recently in terms of fitting it over a wetsuit.
Well, one of the problems with the dive in New Zealand is that we wear so much clothing underneath the dry suit that my forearms become about the size of my calves normally. Yeah. And so the strap on the watch wasn't long enough, and I tried to bodgy something up before the trip, but it just wasn't adequate. So I ended up just putting it in my pocket, and then I could bring it out and glance at it from time to time when I was sitting in my habitats for all of those 12 hours on the way up.
What do you do to pass time in those 12 hours, by the way, those stops?
That is a good question. So Craig, my dive companion, was in there with me, and it's pretty cosy. Sort of our faces are about 6 inches apart for probably 5 of those hours when we're squashed into the smaller habitats. So Craig doesn't really like talking very much when we're diving. So I take great pleasure in just chattering to him the entire time. And he's a prisoner. He can't go anywhere.
Well, that's a risky move when you're relying on someone a couple hundred metres in a cave underground. Brave in many ways. Do you...
but after a few hours, that wears out, obviously, and you go into a bit of a trance and just stare at the wall and try and...
Twist the bezel on your watch.
Sure.
Play with my bezel.
Oh, dear. And I understand you've got another project in the works, so we're not the only podcasters currently in the room. You're got something in the planning stages, or is it...
No, it's live.
It's live?
Yeah, I
think
there's 2 episodes up as of this recording. Congratulations.
Yep.
Thank you. That's a real big step, actually, I have to say. I might not have embarked on it. I probably should have asked you guys first if it was very much work.
Look, I mean, we've been doing it maybe for 5 minutes longer than you have, so don't ask us.
Yeah, but look, I get bored very easily. I'm the classic, if you want something done, ask a busy man. I've always got to have too much to do, otherwise I start to go a bit mad. So I thought, well, how can I ruin my life even further? I'll start a podcast. And I mentioned earlier, I'm really fascinated by talking to other adventurers and risk takers about what drives them. And, I started thinking about things that I absolutely could not do, like base jumping. There is no way that I could stand at the top of a cliff and jump off with a parachute on my back. I just know that is a fact.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
They might say, oh, come on, you would get used to it eventually. No, it's not going to happen. So I thought, that seems to be such a dangerous sport, and I'm just using this one as an example. But, those guys mustn't jump off every time with the thought in their mind, I'm probably going to die, because they're not stupid, I assume. So I wanted to talk to people like that and just find out what they're doing, in their brain that allows them to repeatedly do that kind of activity, and how do they mitigate the risks, and how do they justify the risks to themselves or to their family when, we know that they seem to perish not that infrequently. And people say the same stuff about cave diving, and obviously I don't have a death wish. I wouldn't.
Yeah, I was about to say, I mean, people in glass cave diving houses shouldn't throw stones.
Yeah. So the show's called Real Risk, just to let everyone know.
Yeah, basically talking to every different type of adventurer I can think of.
Cool.
Well, I reckon you should call up the old Bremont ambassador list, and I think pretty much everyone there. That's
the roller deck.
Yeah,
and we'll link that up. Crossed my mind. There's some pretty cool people in there.
And so, how do people find Real Risk?
On all the usual platforms now, so Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google and YouTube, you name it. It seems to be pretty easy to get it around. So I think it's off to a good start. I've had just 2 episodes, and another 2 have been done but not yet published. So I'm going to try and release it once a week and see how that goes.
Great.
Awesome. We'll link that up as well in our show
Definitely.
notes so that people can find it. And one more thing I wanted to hear before we finish is you've got a book.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that, because like you said, you've been busy over the last few years. What was that like for you?
It was really good. It was really enjoyable. Now, Craig and I are not published authors previously, and we are probably not known for our literary abilities. But so we enlisted the help of a professional writer to give us a hand, an amazing guy called Ellis Hannikin from New York. And Ellis is a really charming guy. A lot of his stuff we really enjoyed. And so he helped us sort of pen this not very weighty tome, but it's basically the story of the Thai cave rescue. It's called Against All Odds, and it's published by Penguin Random House. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be that easy to get internationally, but certainly in Australasia, it's easy to find a copy. Okay. And we've had really positive feedback from it. So it feels really good to get our version of the facts down and something we can remember the whole story with.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and obviously I think there's going to be a fair few people that are intrigued and want to get the full story in more detail. Story, So I've kind of had goosebumps most of this chat, so we'll share those details as well and trying to find a link for that. But Felix, one last question.
And finally, is there, obviously we've been sort of spending a lot of time, maybe not doing some of the stuff we're normally doing at the moment, but do you have anything to recommend, or what's been sort of getting you through the days?
Oh, I still am fascinated by the story of Alex Honnold, the climber who repeatedly climbed El Capitan in Yosemite National Park and then finally did it without rope. The documentary that came out of that was called Free Solo, directed by Jimmy Chin and his partner. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely one of the best things I've seen in the last 12 months. So anyone who's interested in adventure or risk-taking should see that because that guy is some sort of machine that's on another level to anyone else I've ever met.
Free solo.
We'll link that up as well.
Definitely. Highly recommend.
Yeah, awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Harris, OAM.
Thank you.
It must be a long list now.
There's a whole bunch of letters after your name. We're not going to...
You have a Wikipedia page, so, we'll just link that up for everyone because there's too many titles.
Half the alphabet. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure to chat to you. And again, thank you for finding time to, get on the call. And, it's an absolutely gripping story. And
our treat.
Cool. Crazy stuff.
Felix, I don't know about you, but that was a fantastic opportunity to chat to the good doctor.
It's nuts. You sort of think about these things. I do. I'm like, oh yeah, cool. We're rescuing cars in a cave. Then you hear him and you think about like the stuff about the moral implications, not what you initially sort of think. Like that's the stuff that keeps him up at night.
Yeah.
That's nuts. I mean,
because I think when you condense that story down to like the quick take of it, swam down into this really dangerous cave when you shouldn't be swimming in caves to rescue, this group of 13 people.
Doing things that you shouldn't do to...
You're doing everything that you shouldn't do in the safest way possible. You inject them with ketamine, tie them up, strap a face mask so that they can breathe, and then pull them out.
Little Thai kid burritos pushing them through a tunnel.
One by one, and just hope for the best. It's pretty incredible.
It's not Hollywood.
No.
That's like, if this was a Hollywood movie, which I'm sure it will be in a few years or whatever...
Who would play the good doctor, Harris, in it?
Oh, one of the Hemsworth, low-key Hemsworth.
Yeah.
One of the other Hemsworths.
One of the other ones.
Maybe.
Or Banner, maybe?
Banner's probably too old by now. Anyway, it's not Hollywood. This is the real logistics and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, that was amazing. So thank you so much to first of all, Dr. Harris. That was amazing. Thank you to Bremont for helping us get him on the line.
Yeah, much love.
And who else do we need to thank, Andy?
Our listeners. And our producer, Major Tom Media.
Major Tom, he's the guy.
Putting up with all of our antics and bringing this show together.
So if you've rescued people from a cave and want to get in touch with us, how do they do it?
You can shoot us an email at otthepodcast@gmail.com
or just hit us up on Instagram.
Insta ot.podcast.
Nice.
Well, we'll catch you next time.
Cheers.